Alexander Rossi should never have been leading the last lap of the Indy 500 as a rookie. I mean, after all, he'd never raced at that track before. He had never even raced in a race that long, 500 miles. And his team was not one of the big budget operations. They didn't even have a primary sponsor. You know, the company whose name is painted on the side of the car and writes the big check and pays all the big bills. They didn't even have a primary sponsor until just weeks before the event. Nope, he never should have been in a position to potentially win the Indy 500, but he was. And he owed it not so much to incredible speed, but to great communication. I could be wrong, but I'm going to guess that most of the people here are probably never going to drive in the Indy 500, right? You're not going to be there. But the reality is the things that team did that day, the way they communicated, are the kinds of things that every company, every organization needs to do on a regular basis. Now, for me to stand here and tell you that if your company, your organization communicates better, you'll be more successful, it's pretty much a no-brainer, isn't it? Which is why sometimes it's great to hear a story about a group of good people who did something amazing, all because they communicated the right way. So let's start by going back to 2016, just a couple years ago, and I'll introduce the players. The first one is the driver, Alexander Rossi. Rossi was a rookie. He had done well in the minor leagues of racing, but he'd never won anything what we'll call the major leagues. In fact, the Indy 500 that year was only the 6th time he had ever even driven in an IndyCar race. His team owner was a guy by the name of Brian Herta. Brian Herta is a former driver who'd gone to the other side of the pit wall, become a team owner, had his team for a number of years, but the reality was they had only won a single race in all their years of trying. And that team, well, it was a good team. They had good engineers, good mechanics, but when you get right down to it, speed is all about money, and they never had the budget necessary to pull off a big victory or compete at the front. You know, it's a lot like a lot of organizations. You don't have the resources necessary to make winning, to be successful, a little easier. And there's one other player I need to mention, and that's me. I spent the last 3 decades covering auto racing for ESPN and other television networks, and that day, I was part of the ABC broadcast team. I was a pit reporter going up and down pit lane telling the stories of what was going on during the race. And I was assigned to cover a number of drivers, including Alexander Rossi. Of course, he's a rookie, right? How many times am I going to talk about him during the race? I have other drivers who I'm going to spend much more time talking about. And let's explain the Indy 500. It was first run back in 1911. It is truly a test of man and machine. And some of the people who've won that race have gone on to become very famous. Names like Mario Andretti, A.J. Foyt, Helio Castroneves. How many people know Helio Castroneves because he won the Indy 500 3 times? How many know Helio Castroneves because he won Dancing with the Stars once? There you go. Just shows that race car drivers are actually athletes, number one. And number two, a little publicity never, ever hurts. And there are some drivers at the Indianapolis 500 that you've never heard of. Guys like Lloyd Ruby. Lloyd Ruby is considered the greatest race car driver by many people to never win the Indy 500. Something always seemed to get in the way. For example, back in 1969, Lloyd Ruby is leading the race, late in the race, and he has to come in for a pit stop. A pit stop is where they come in, they change the tires, they put the fuel in. So he comes in, they plug the fuel hose into the side of the car. There's a guy at the front of the car. His job is to watch as they come in, keep track of everything, and then send them back out. He's watching as they put on all the tires. When they get the tires done, he motions for Lloyd Ruby to go back out on the track. There's just one problem. They hadn't finished putting the fuel into the car. When Lloyd Ruby pulled away, it literally ripped open the side of the fuel tank. All the fuel poured onto the ground. Lloyd Ruby's day was done. All because of a communication failure, a communication problem that happened in that pit stop during that race. By the way, who won the race that day in 1969? Mario Andretti. Who do we remember to this day? Mario Andretti. I've talked a lot with Brian Herta about what happened that day, and he likes to point out that his team, which is really a company, has what he calls a culture of communication. It's where everybody on the team has the ability to speak up, to throw out an idea, and most importantly, to be heard. And that culture of communication, it can't start the day of the race. It can't start the week of the race. It can't start the month of the race. It has to be built into the organization. It's like our companies, our organizations. The day you have a crisis, you can't suddenly go, hey, let's get together, figure out how to communicate, and then we'll solve the crisis. It has to be built into the culture of the organization. But at the halfway point in the race, Alexander Rossi found himself literally in last place on the track. Dead last. kind of hard to win the race when you're in last place, right? So the team has to strategize. They have to come up with a new idea. They're back on the pit box, they're working, they're throwing out ideas. Meanwhile, their driver is turning laps at 220 miles an hour. So they got to go really fast. And they come up with what can only be described as a really bold idea. Instead of going faster than everybody else, you know what they're going to do? They're going to get better fuel mileage. Now, I know what you're thinking. How can you possibly win a race when everybody else is going really fast by getting better fuel mileage? But here's the thing. What if you were able to compete the entire 500 miles and do one less pit stop? One less pit stop. How important is that? Well, a pit stop in an Indy car, modern Indy car, actually takes 8 or 9 seconds. That's all it takes to change the tires and put in the fuel. But before you can get in and do that, you have to come off the racetrack. You got to slow down, get onto pit lane. There's a pit lane speed limit, 60 miles an hour. You got to go all the way up pit lane, pull in your pit box, get the work done, accelerate, go back out. It actually takes about 40 seconds of race time to do that 8 or 9 second pit stop. How important is 40 seconds? It just so happens that that is how long it takes to turn one complete lap at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. So if you can do one less pit stop, it's like gaining a 1 lap advantage. Think about that. It's kind of like when you're on a trip, right? If you can stop at the bathroom one less time, stop and get fuel one less time on your trip, you get there just a little bit sooner. That's exactly what their plan was. So they came on the radio and they told them, hey, here's what we need to do. We need to get better fuel mileage. And how many people have those cars now, brand new, modern car, and you actually get the readout on your dashboard, tells you what your fuel mileage is, right? You're driving to work, maybe it says 25 miles to the gallon. Well, imagine I call you up on the phone and I say, hey, you're on your way to work. It would be helpful today if you got 28 or 29 miles to the gallon. It's really not that hard. You know, you ease up on the throttle a little bit, don't floor it away from the lights, maybe coast through the turns. Of course, imagine I told you to do that when you were going 220 miles an hour at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It's just a little more difficult. Let me stop right here and make an important point about communications. It is critical that we communicate at the right speed. Now, there are times when we need to slow things down. We need to talk to more people, gather more information, get more research. But there are other times when we need to speed it up, like when deadlines are approaching, or if your driver is turning laps at 220 miles an hour at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But most importantly, what we don't want to do is confuse the two. We don't want to let artificial deadlines push us faster than we should be going. And the flip side is we don't want to not recognize when we have real deadlines, when things have to move at a faster pace. It is critical that we communicate at the right speed. At this point, they're telling him the equivalent of you have to get 50 miles to the gallon. Now, if I told you you had to get 50 miles to the gallon when you drive to work tomorrow, you'd be like, you're insane. Now, what if I told you not only do you have to get 50 miles to the gallon, but you're leaving at the same time as your boss and you have to beat him to work? That's basically what they were telling Alexander Rossi. I'm on pit lane that day, and I'm listening to the communications between the driver and the team, between Alexander Rossi and Brian Herta. And I vividly remember Alexander Rossi, the rookie, telling on the radio, there is no way I can possibly do that. It is impossible. But you know what? The team strategized, they gave him ideas, they gave him ways to pull it off, they gave him advice, they coached him through the entire process. And the interesting thing is it turns out that Alexander Rossi is not only a great race car driver, he is really good at saving fuel. Second place, as they cross starting the last lap, is 20 seconds behind Alexander Rossi. Alexander Rossi goes through the first turn. He still is under power, still has fuel. Now, I should point out, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, we call it an oval, but in reality, it's a rectangle with the 4 corners. And each one of those corners we call a turn. Turn 1, 2, 3, and 4. So he goes through turn number 1, still under power. He goes through turn number 2, he's still under power. But as Alexander Rossi enters turn number 3, he runs out of fuel. He is 1 mile from the finish line of the Indy 500, about to win the race as a rookie, and he runs out of fuel. They said, instead of the car going as it goes by, it just went whoosh. You know the sound of a car slowly rolling across the asphalt? But here's the thing. It is amazing how far and how fast you can coast when you're going 200 miles an hour. And Alexander Rossi was able to coast all the way through turn 4, all the way across the finish line, and win the Indy 500 as a rookie. They said he whooshed across the finish line. Second place, 5 seconds behind. Almost caught him, but he didn't. Alexander Rossi and his team pulled off one of the greatest upsets ever in auto racing history. And you know how they did it? A culture of communication and communicating at the right speed. Critical lessons for everybody to remember. Thank you for your time. I'm Rick DeBruhl. Hope you enjoy the rest of the presenters today. Thank you.